getting him out of the control position he was in, I thought was essential, and whether that be done by one means or another was not as important. But it's clear to me that were there not the oil resources in Iraq, the whole picture of how that part of the Middle East developed would have been different.
We're also joined in studio by Naomi Klein, author of the book The Shock Doctrine, The Rise of Disaster Capitalism. Your response to that, Naomi Klein?
Well, I'm just wondering if it troubles Mr. Greenspan at all that wars over resources in other countries are actually illegal. Mr. Greenspan has praised the rule of law, the importance of the rule of law in his book, but in his statements about the reasons why this has not been publicly discussed, he's said that it's not politically expedient at this moment. But it's not just that it's not politically expedient, Mr. Greenspan. Are you aware that according to the Hague regulations and the Geneva Conventions, it is illegal for one country to invade another over its natural resources?
No, what I was saying is that the issue which, as you know, most people who were pressing for the war were concerned with were weapons of mass destruction. I personally believe that Saddam was behaving in a way that he probably very well had, he almost certainly had weapons of mass destruction. I was surprised as most that he didn't. But what I was saying is that my reason for being pleased to see Saddam out of office had nothing to do with the weapons of mass destruction. It had to do with the potential threat that he could create to the rest of the world.
Yes, I realize that, but he was not simply deposed. The U.S. invaded Iraq, occupied it, and took control over its resources. And under international law, that it is illegal to wage wars to gain access to other countries, sovereign countries, natural resources.
Yes, no, I'm fully aware of the fact that that is a highly, it's a terribly important issue. And as I said in other commentaries, I've always thought the issue of what essentially amounts to what is often called preventive action on the part of some countries to secure resources or something else like that is an issue that goes back to the Cold War, when we had the very difficult moral dilemma of when do you what do you do when you think a missile is coming in our direction, you're not sure whether it's an accident or not an accident. And that is a problem which I think is a deep moral problem in civilized society. And the issue is one which I don't think we're going to resolve very easily. And as you point out, yes, I am a believer in the rule of law, and I think it is a critical issue not only for domestic economies, but for the world economy as a whole.
Naomi Klein.
You've also advocated economic shock therapy and supported IMF programs that have transformed economies very, very quickly. And then you say that you are in support of the rule of law. But I'm just wondering how in a country like Russia there could be rule of law when it's being transformed and fast forward in that way.
Well, remember that you don't get a market economy merely by eliminating central planning. And remember, when the Berlin Wall came down and the Soviet Union disintegrated, you didn't have a market economy. What you basically had was a black market economy. And they try to develop the institutions of democratic society, and it's not something which they have had back for generations. And as you can see now, there's an increasing authoritarianism. It's a very, it's a society which has very different trends at different levels of that society. And I don't know exactly where they're coming out, but I don't like the direction it's been going in recent years.
I wanted to go back to Iraq and ask you about, well, a piece by Jim Steele and Don Bartlett that came out in Vanity Fair, where they're talking about the billions lost in Iraq. And they begin their piece by saying between April 2003 and June 2004 in U.S. currency, much of it belonging to the Iraqi people, was shipped from the Federal Reserve to Baghdad, where it was dispensed by the Coalition Provisional Authority. Some of the cash went to pay for projects and keep ministries afloat. But incredibly, at least $9 billion has gone missing, unaccounted for, in a frenzy of mismanagement and greed. Alan Greenspan, when you're head of the Federal Reserve, how much knowledge do you have of this? And did you investigate this? Were you aware of this at the time?
Well, let me say that what we were involved in was essentially endeavoring to create a viable currency for the Central Bank of Iraq. And what we did do was, I think very successfully, create what is a viable financial system even under the circumstances that currently exist. There was, as far as I can judge, a huge drain of the resources into areas which nobody to this day can understand or follow. It had nothing to do with the central bank in our relationships with them. We were merely acting as an intermediary to assist them in creating a system which they now have, which is working reasonably well, despite all of the problems that are going on. The issue which you're referring to had nothing to do with the Federal Reserve in any of our relationships with the central bank.
Well, they're talking about in one day, for example, the East Rutherford Operations Center of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, 100 Orchard Street in East Rutherford, a tractor-trailer truck pulling up. And though accustomed to receiving and shipping large quantities of cash, the vault had never before processed a single order of this magnitude, $2.4 billion in $100 bills. But ultimately, again, $9 billion of $12 billion gone missing in Iraq.
I am not familiar with any such evidence, and it was certainly not brought to my attention. I frankly find it very unlikely that those orders of magnitudes were involved in any of the numbers that we were dealing with. You have to make certain that there's been a lot of confusion about losses, and people have used the dinar, the basic currency unit of Iraq, and assumed they were American dollars. And of course, that gives you a highly distorted view. I've seen several reports fairly recently in which that sort of mistake was being made.
Well,
what I can tell you is that no such numbers of any order of magnitude of the type you are discussing came to the attention of the Federal Reserve.
This is based on that award-winning article in Vanity Fair, or the team who have won.
Award-winning doesn't necessarily.
Well, I mean Jim Bartlett and Don Bartlett and Jim Steele, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalists. I'm sure you know their work. But Naomi Klein?
Well, I would just add that it's quite surprising, actually, that Mr. Greenspan is unaware of the scandal around Iraq's missing billions, because Paul Bremer had to testify before Congress and was asked directly about those missing billions. It's been the subject of very high-level investigations. There's a huge paper trail around it, so this is hardly a secret, and it's hardly just a matter that's confined to Vanity Fair. This is.
Well, I'm not saying that the losses are not real. I think they are, because obviously we can't account for all the oil revenues. I'm just merely saying it's not something which was directly related to any of the actions which the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, to which we're referring, was involved, as far as I know.
Alan Greenspan, we have to break for 60 seconds, but we'll be back with you. Alan Greenspan, the former chair of the Federal Reserve from 1987 to 2006. His memoir is out now. It's called The Age of Turbulence, Adventures in a New World. We'll be back with him in 1 minute. Stay with us. Kronos Quartet, Requiem for a Dream. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Our guests are Naomi Klein, author of The Shock Doctrine, and Alan Greenspan, the former head chair of the Federal Reserve. His book, The Age of Turbulence, Adventures in a New World. In fact, you were a classical and jazz musician, weren't you, Alan Greenspan, before you went into economics?
Well, I studied at Juilliard, which means you become a classical musician, and indeed that is still my fundamental interest in music. But I went on as a teenager to play in a dance band and spent a year and a half traveling around the country as a jazz musician.
Well, I wanted to move forward to your work as head of the Fed, as head of the Federal Reserve Bank, and ask you about that piece by Paul Krugman called Sad Alan's Lament, that goes to that issue of supporting President Bush's tax cuts. In his piece, Paul Krugman says, Mr. Greenspan has just published a book in which he castigates the Bush administration for his fiscal irresponsibility. Well, I'm sorry, says Paul Krugman, but that criticism comes 6 years late and $1 trillion short. He says that Mr. Greenspan now says he didn't mean to give the Bush tax cuts a green light, that he was surprised at the political reaction to his remarks. He goes on to say, the first big chance you had to clarify yourself came a few weeks after your initial testimony in 2001 when you appeared before the Senate Committee on Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs. He says again and again you were offered the opportunity to say something that would help rein in runaway tax cutting, each time evading the question, often replying by reading from your own previous testimony. He said if anyone had doubts about Mr. Greenspan's determination not to inconvenience the Bush administration, those doubts were resolved 2 years later when the administration proposed another round of tax cuts, even though the budget was now deep in deficit. And guess what? The former high priest of fiscal responsibility did not object. And he goes on from there. He says in 2004, you expressed support for making the Bush tax cuts permanent. Remember, these are the tax cuts he now says he didn't endorse, and argued that the budget should be balanced with cuts in entitlement spending, including Social Security benefits instead. Of course, back in 2001, he specifically assured Congress that cutting taxes would not threaten Social Security. Your response, Alan Greenspan?
Well, I find it very unfortunate. Paul is a good economist. I've known him for years. He is wrong fundamentally in many of the facts, in fact, probably all of the ones you've just cited. First of all, I was in favor of tax cuts of any type when it looked as though, according to all the technical experts, we were confronted with very large potential increases in surpluses. If we allowed those surpluses to run when the debt of the United States essentially went to zero, we would find that the federal government was beginning to accumulate huge amounts of assets of corporate business. There would be no alternative to that. And if you look at the possibilities of what Lyndon Johnson or Richard Nixon would have done under those circumstances, it becomes extremely scary. It was only when it appeared that the forecasts were false that indeed we were not running in or not likely to run into these large surpluses, and indeed they disappeared. At that point, I reverted to my older position, namely,